right, in this section, we're going to cover variables. Now, variables are one of these things that are fundamental to any programming language and fundamental to computer science. And without understanding variables and how to create them and use them, you're pretty much dead in the water when it comes to doing any kind of programming. And this doesn't matter whether you're programming in Swift or Python or JavaScript or anything else. You're going to need a good understanding of variables. And variables is a pretty broad topic, but we're going to cover the very basics, just the fundamentals to get started. And then we can always advance into more complex variables as we go through the course. So let's get started. Okay, so let's jump into variables. So what we're going to do is do 5 different topics associated with variables. The first one is what are they and why do we need them, which is really critical. Second is how do we create them. The third will be how do we give them values. The fourth is how do we read their values back. And then the fifth section will be updating their values. Now, none of these are particularly complicated. And as I said in the intro, variables are super important to understand for all of computer science. So let's dive in. So what I've done is sort of started out considering a potential game. Now, this game is something you can find on the net. And essentially, it's very simple. What it is a prospector that's walking across a brick wall, and coming at him is either tumbleweeds or coins. And if he gets hit by a tumbleweed, he loses a life. And then, of course, if his lives go down to 0, then the game is over. However, if he runs into a coin, he collects the coin, and then his score goes up by 1. And obviously, these things just keep moving across as we go along in the game. So the question really is, considering this game, what might the computer need to remember? And so this is where I would sort of open it up to the class and have a little discussion, let people volunteer different ideas about what the computer needs to remember for the game to work. So you could imagine, I probably need to remember score as an example, right? If I know the score, then I've got to remember that so that I know what to add and how to increment that score value when we get a new coin. Another potential obvious one is lives, right? So we need to know how many lives did we start with and how many are remaining based on how many times we've been hit by the tumbleweed. And of course, there are plenty of other possibilities that are totally valid. So we're just going to cover those 2 in the course, but many other possibilities are totally plausible. For example, somebody might have said, well, we need to know the position of the prospector, right? So the position of the prospector in this case in the game is high or low when they're jumping. So we need to know, have they moved up or down? And obviously, if we're updating the graphics with it, we need to know that position. Another one could be coins remaining. So how many coins does the game start with, and then how many are left? Because it could be that you can continue to collect coins until you've collected them all, in which case you're the big winner because you've gotten all the coins. So it really depends on how the game is defined. But there's a bunch of things that have to be remembered, and that's the point. So what you'll find in a lot of these presentations and overviews and concepts that I do with computer science is I'm a big fan of making analogies to something in the real world that people will be able to relate with and understand. So in this case, what I've done is related a variable to a box, basically. So imagine a box where every item that we need to remember gets a box. So first of all, we probably want to give the box a name because we want to know when something's inside it what it is, because we can't see through the box. They're not transparent boxes in this analogy. So for example, we could put a name on this box like score if we were going to remember the score. And then of course, each box is also going to contain a value. So we're going to have something inside the box. So a box is basically a variable. So we're making the analogy that a variable is basically a container. It is something that contains a value. So in this case, we have box, which is here, and then we have score, which is the name right here, and that's what we mean by score. And then we have value here, and that is value. So the box is a variable. And every variable is going to have basically a name and a value. So creating a variable is really easy. It's basically three pieces. First off, we have to declare it. Secondly, we need to give it a name. And third, we need to give it a value. And if we do those three things, we have set up a variable properly. So let's take a look at how we do that. So declaring a variable in Swift basically starts with var, as you see right here. And what I've done is this basically is just a screenshot from the playground. So we should know that from going through the tool chain and seeing how playgrounds work. Again, if you're using Replit, it looks a little different, but it's conceptually the same thing. And what we've done is we have this statement right here that's been entered, and we have the full syntax of the full thing. And what we're doing now is just describing this first piece, right? It starts with var. So var is basically how we declare a variable in Swift. And the cool thing to remember about var as a memory trick is we're declaring a variable. So var, short for variable, should not be hard to remember. That's the first thing. Okay, the next part is to give it a name. So we want to give the variable a name. We know that all of our boxes need to be labeled, so all variables have to have names. And in this case, we give score as the name of the variable. Now, the next part is we want to give it a value. So basically, we use the equal sign here. So this equal sign right here is not like the algebraic equal sign that you might have had in algebra in math class. This is basically an assignment. And the way you want to always read this is gets the value of. Basically, that's what we want to always associate with the equal sign. Okay, so we basically are going to assign the value of the variable by saying an equal sign gets the value of, and then finally we are referencing the value itself, which in this case is 45. Okay, so it's really those three things. It's declaring it, giving it a name, and assigning it a value. So could we use a different variable name to remember score? So this is another question for students to kind of think about and discuss. You know, why was it important that this name right here be score? I mean, what's so critical about that? Swift doesn't know score from name or anything else, right? It's just a sequence of characters, and it has no semantic meaning, meaning that the computer program itself does not associate it with a score. It's only us humans that do. So score is what we named it. Why is it important that we do that? So this is a typical spot to pause and let people and let the students comment on that. Now, as they do, we could say, well, why would this not be a good name, right? So now we've said car here. And again, a point of discussion is why is car not good? Okay, and from the obvious perspective, hopefully that people come to here is that the name is implying what's inside it. So if I put the name on the box of car and I had a bunch of boxes down in the basement and I would go to it, I would think, oh, there's a model car in this box. And actually, no, what's in the box is a 45, or what is in the box is a score. So this would be very poorly named as a variable. It doesn't mean it won't work. It doesn't mean it won't run correctly, but it would be considered really bad form and not an acceptable way for a programmer to write code. So the other thing I want to do is just talk about a couple of things that are important from a syntax perspective related to variables. And variables basically have three things. First of all, they have to start with a letter. So they cannot start with a number. They can't start with a dash. We want them to start with A through Z, one of those letters. Okay. The second thing is that we want to follow them with any number of letters and numbers. So once you've started with a letter, then you can continue to put other numbers, letters, underscores, and those types of things in your names. But the last thing to remember is that it cannot include a space. So we can't have a name of a variable. Like you could write on the side of a box the name of something in the box and have a space in it. But for Swift and to be legal syntax, it cannot have a space as a part of the name. It has to be one long string of characters and numbers as long as we start with a character. Okay, so initial values at the start of our game. So what might they be? So in this scenario, we're saying your score probably starts out at 0 because you haven't started, you just started the game. So you start at level 0. And also you're given initially 3 lives, let's say. I'm just inventing that. The game designer can decide how many lives that you're going to get. And so the first thing we want to do is, with these 2 things that we want to remember, is 1, create the box. So here we're creating the box, and again, we're using var right here to do that, right? The second thing is we want to give the box a name. So we're giving the name here, and that's here, right? So we're naming it. And then the third is we want to put the value of 0 in the box. And remember, this is the assignment gets the value of, and 0 ends up in the box. Now, one thing to highlight here is you'll notice in the text I said gets the initial value of. And the reason I say initial is because this is declared as a var, it can change over time. So we're putting an initial value of 0 in there, but it's not staying that way forever. The score would go up. Hopefully you'll get some coins and your score increments. And so variables are allowed to change over time. And that's important because in the next section, when we talk about constants, that won't be true. So create another variable to hold lives. So let's do that. So what are the steps? So now at this point, let's see if the class can tell us what the steps would be to actually create a new variable that holds lives. So just like before, where we had var score 0, and that's what the box was created here, now we're saying var lives, that creates the box, right? So this part creates the box and gives it the name. And then we say gets the value of 3, and that's the equal sign, which remember says gets the value of, or we could say gets the initial value of, and the value 3, and 3 ends up in our box. So that is how we create variables. It's the var, the name, equals for gets the value of, and a value. It's that simple. Now, let's look at the next part of this, which is how do we get the value out of the box? So now we walk down in the basement, we find a box called score, and we need to be able to find out, open up the box, and get what's inside the box. In this case, it's the score value. So here's an example where we say, you know, this declared a variable, and then in a previous lab, we were asked to print our name or print hello world or print something about ourselves, and what went inside the print statement here was basically a string, right? So I might say Kevin, and that's what went in there, but not anymore. So now what we're going to do is not do this literal. We are going to actually put the variable name itself. You'll notice there's no quotes around it. So this is the variable name, and there's no quotes. It's actually just referring to the box name or the variable name score. So when Swift sees that, it's going to go into that variable and pull out the value. So in this case, when we do a print of score, we should see the value, in this case 0, show up on the console. Now, the other thing we can do is we can take that value and copy it into another box. So here, for example, we have the variable high score right here. So this was declared here, right? And then we say gets the value of, and we say score. Well, score already exists. We assume that because we're referencing it. So here's a box called score, and it's basically got a value of 0. So when we use that gets the value of, this arrow right here moves and copies this value 0 into the other box. So this is how the variable gets a new value based on another variable. Again, we're not putting a 0 here because we don't know what score is. Score could have a 4 in it, or a 48, or 42, or whatever. And so whatever that value is, that's what we want to end up in the box. So now let's look at updating a value. So when we update the variable, what we mean by that is that what we put in the variable originally, we're going to change. And now we're going to give it a new value. But we don't really need to create a new box to do that. We can use the same box or the same variable and just update its value. So when we look at this example here, we see that first of all, var score, what does that do? It actually creates the variable because it has a var in front of it. So var score is creating the box, it's creating the variable, and then we're giving it an initial value of 1. But what's interesting is this next line right here, we need to update the value. So in this case, notice what we're missing. The second line does not contain var. So this is not there on the second line. It's just score, which we're referencing. So we're referencing the box that already exists, and we're saying that you get the value of 2 here, gets the new value. So score gets the new value of 2. And that's how we assign a value into a variable. We just don't put that var in front of it. So let's look at this next example. Why not this, right? So why not var score equals 0? And then the next one is say var score equals 1. Does that not work? And it doesn't work. And the reason for that is that you can only have one box called score. You can only have one variable called score. You cannot have 2 with the same name. That would be very confusing to the computer. So all of your variable names need to be unique. So in this case, var score is 0, and then we say we declare another variable with the same name. That is not going to work. So here, var score is legal to start with. We've created the box. This is illegal because we're declaring 2 boxes with the same name, and that's not going to work. Okay? So in summary, updating a variable just means drop the var. That's all it means. No var, just reference the variable on the left-hand side of the equal sign. It's going to be over here, and you want to read this as gets the value of and 1, and you've now updated the value. So that's variables, basically. That'll get you started with variables and get you a long way. And what we did, again, is we talked about what are they, why we need them. Remember, we have to remember things. Otherwise, we have no way of managing a game if we're not remembering the values that are important. Secondly, we talked about how do we create them. We create them using var, right? The third part is how do we give them values? Well, we give them values using the equal sign, right? And then the fourth is how do we read the values? Well, we just reference them. So we would just, if we're looking at score, we just say the name. That's how we get the value. And then finally, how do we update the values? Again, we use the equal sign, gets the value of, but remember, we don't have var in there. Var is not a part of it when we're assigning a value. And that's variables.